would like to extend a warm welcome to all the distinguished guests, speakers, and participants. Your presence today reflects the importance of the discussions we are hoping to have today and the valuable insights that we are hoping to share. So before we dive into the exciting sessions ahead, I'm delighted to introduce our Division Director, Dr. Parul Munjal, who will be officially welcoming you all and setting the tone for the event. Ma'am, please.
Thank you, Ria. So, a very good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you all for being here this morning to be part of this conversation around conserving culturally significant places in India. It is my privilege to welcome you all to this event through which we mark the completion of 20 years of the adoption of the INTACH Charter for the conservation of unprotected architectural heritage and sites in India. It's a part of your delegate pack, and many of you may have got multiple copies because we are trying to, over the last year and onwards, disseminate, this as a document extensively. I extend a warm welcome to the paper presenters here. Thank you for being here. The session chairs for kindly agreeing to be part of this, and all members of the INTACH family, and also our special guests who've taken time out to be here today. Welcome to all of you who are viewing the sessions virtually through the live streaming as well. So the symposium is a follow-up to a call for papers that we had formulated, the editorial team of INTACH Journal for Heritage Studies had formulated and announced in October 2025. And we had actually outlined some key focus areas. These focus areas had emerged from deliberations over the years, feedback, reviews, inputs that were published either in academic journals such as Context-Built Living and Natural, or presented at various INTACH platforms like the INTACH convention that happened in 2022, and workshops, feedback sessions with the heads of divisions, our staff members, and input from the Academic Council of the INTACH Heritage Academy. In articulating the title of this call for papers and the symposium, Conservation of Unprotected Architectural Heritage and Sites, as mentioned in the INTACH Charter, is referred to as culturally significant places in India, derived from the Borough Charter, the Australia ICOMOS Charter for Places of Cultural Significance 2013. The Borough Charter applies to all types of, I'm quoting here, all types of places of cultural significance, including natural, indigenous, and historic places with cultural values. As we invite examination of conservation in the present-day context of India, we are conscious of shifts in the global scenario that acknowledge a wider construct of places of cultural significance over the 2 decades since the INTACH Charter was adopted. Over the last 2 decades, there have been developments in global frameworks that focus more on acknowledgement of diversity and inclusivity in the definitions of heritage as well as approaches towards its conservation. The idea of heritage has become more and more all-encompassing, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and at the same time region-specific. The question is, are these aspects specific to India that remain unaddressed? Are there such aspects? Do we need to propose frameworks at the national level? Do we need to revisit certain terminologies and definitions from an alternate lens? A case in point is the term living heritage. It has been addressed in the INTACH Charter as unprotected sites that are still in use. It has been referred to it in such a way, while it is commonly used today as a synonym for intangible cultural heritage. On the other hand, why couldn't we call natural heritage also living heritage? Because it is the components of natural heritage such as flora and fauna which are literally living. So these are this is just to bring a case in point with respect to how we refer to such certain terms and how various disciplines could be perceiving these terms. As we discuss a national approach, it is also important to address whether or not the cultural diversity within our country is represented in our understanding of the conservation approaches we are talking about. How does the approach and decision making vary across regions, communities, typologies of heritage in India? Is there underlying traditional knowledge that is guiding interventions in culturally significant places which are localized or regional in their nature? How does the decision making get informed by the environmental, social, political, and economic context of the place? And who are the significant stakeholders in this entire process? National and regional realities of the present day are not the same as that of the early 21st century. This brings us to questions around how these socio-economic and environmental shifts are actually impacting conservation efforts in the current Indian context. How can we adapt to the changing dynamics of the country as it evolves from a developing to a developed nation? What are the new uses of heritage that make it relevant in this evolving context? Are policies, schemes, and agendas adding to issues in conservation or solving these? What are the challenges of development that are conflicting with questions of identity? And how does heritage get positioned in the minds of people? Furthermore, various processes involved in conservation can impact the people around or those involved in the process directly or indirectly. These impacts need to be examined and understood better. What are the measurable positive and negative impacts in the social and economic context? How can these potential impacts be embedded into the project scope? How do they shape the conservation approach to ensure a focus on sustainable development? These are the questions we started with, and you would have all seen these questions in the call for papers. And we received a response with 125 abstracts, which was very heartening, out of which 48 were then shortlisted and for presentation of papers through this 2-day symposium. And these abstracts and these ideas that were represented, that were shortlisted, actually bring up discussions around various types and scales of heritage. The range extends from temples and monuments to vernacular heritage, forts, mills, museums, heritage parks, heritage precincts, cities, towns, settlements, sacred groves, cultural landscapes, and indigenous landscapes, in addition to traditional knowledge, riverine heritage, and other expressions of intangible heritage associated with places. The authors have highlighted concerns about representation of built heritage, bridging the tangible and intangible, community involvement, decolonization, usability, utility, adaptive reuse, identity, memories, livelihoods, heritage education, architectural integrity, and the need for typological approaches for conservation. And these are only to name a few, of course. In some cases, specific communities or stakeholder groups have also been addressed in particular. I'm happy to bring up this publication here that we've brought out. We've just printed limited copies here. But this is, of course, we're going to circulate to everyone in soft, and we are happy to bring this out. And the 2 days of the symposium look definitely very promising, and we look forward to engaging with the diverse types and scales of heritage, the multiple lenses of viewing, the concerns around these, and the discourses around approaches towards conservation of heritage. We start with the first day of paper presentations and discussions here today with 17 papers being presented. And tomorrow we'll have online presentations, and 31 papers are going to be presented in the online mode. And these will be spread across 10 sessions, and some of which will be conducted simultaneously. So to enable everybody's able to view, we are going to be streaming today's sessions live on YouTube. And tomorrow we are going to be recording, and then we'll be releasing those recordings on the YouTube channel. Each session is chaired by 2 experts. So this was a question that some asked, that why 2 chairs? So the idea was that there should be 2 experts to enable a rich exchange of ideas amongst the paper presenters and the chairs. Once again, I welcome you all and thank you for enabling this dialogue that has the potential to guide action and approaches in the field of heritage conservation in India. Thank you very much, and a very, very warm welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Due to some circumstances, our esteemed chairman, retired Major General L.K. Gupta, is unable to join us today at the event. Nevertheless, we are honored to have with us our member secretary, Mr. Ravinder Singh. Mr. Singh, a retired administrative officer, served as secretary and additional secretary in India's Ministry of Culture, overseeing the preservation and promotion of tangible and intangible heritage. His significant contributions include initiating cultural festivals abroad, enhancing India's World Heritage sites, and managing heritage conservation projects. He has chaired the India Literacy Board and served as an independent director for Agra Smart City, focusing on sustainable tourism and skill development. Mr. Singh has also contributed to research on heritage management and served as an advisor for various government initiatives. He has extensive experience in general administration, tourism, and cultural preservation. So, I would like to request our esteemed member secretary to kindly say a few words and share some insights with us. Sir, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, and first of all, thank you, Dr. Parul, for giving such a comprehensive overview of the kind of challenges which are there 20 years after INTACH Charter. And in fact, we have seen a paradigm shift in what really culture means and how, from limiting more to conservation on built heritage, we are, in practice at least, INTACH has moved far beyond what was, I think, initially thought of in its chapter. So a welcome to all the delegates, and I'm sure everyone is very keen to listen to what you all have to say, because both with your experience and academic achievements, I'm sure that you will all contribute a lot towards the development of INTACH chapter and its finalization. I have the chairman's address. As you heard, he's not been able to attend today, so I'll just read out what he has to say. The year 2024 marks two important landmarks: completion of 40 years of INTACH and 20 years from the adoption of the INTACH Charter for the conservation of unprotected architectural heritage and sites in India. INTACH was established when it was realized that government alone cannot protect heritage without the people's active involvement. The amount and diversity of heritage in our country is overwhelmingly large, and its conservation is a big challenge that INTACH has been engaged with over the last 4 decades. Through this journey, many diverse and talented individuals and ideas have shaped it to become the prestigious institution it is today, a bastion for cultural awareness and conservation. It has remained true to the ideals and values of cultural conservation and is today a strong and vibrant institution. The institution focused primarily on conservation of the unique cultural identity and heritage of India in its various manifestations. It was peopled by individuals imbued with a deep sense of commitment and dedication to heritage conservation. Through the experience of our earliest associates and our present ones, we have tried to capture how we have evolved and grown into a respected national organization with a reputed standing in society and a voice heard with seriousness in the corridors of power and by the community. Over the years, INTACH has set the agenda for conservation to incorporate intangible heritage crafts, listing, outreach programs, including heritage education and publications, in addition to conservation of built, material, and natural heritage. Its programs and initiatives have effective changes at the policy, social, economic, and cultural level. The goals of community development and empowerment, capacity building, and social and collaborative networks have all contributed to its metamorphosis into a think tank and an influencer in all matters related to heritage conservation. It is frequently invited to be a knowledge partner with various government and non-governmental agencies nationally and internationally. The adoption of the INTACH Charter at the International Convention on November 4th, 2004 was representative of the role of INTACH in acknowledging the need for an approach towards conservation that accommodated the diverse strands of conservation ideology existing in India. While it was formulated as a document for the unprotected architectural heritage and sites in India, it has served as a resource that has been referred at the global level and may have found application beyond unprotected heritages as well. The initial draft of the charter was prepared by Professor A.G.K. Menon, assisted by Naveen Piplani, and developed further based on an inclusive and democratic process of dialogue. 20 years ago, the charter came out as an embodiment of the accumulated experience and expertise of INTACH over a period of 2 decades. Today we stand here with 2 more decades having passed. I am positive that the deliberations of this symposium will highlight socio-cultural and economic ground realities of the present day and help in charting a way forward for conservation approaches for culturally significant places in our country. Thank you. So thank you very much, and I think we are all very keen to hear Professor Menon on what has happened 20 years down the line and what suggestions he has. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. So, of course, we are honored to have with us Professor A.G.K. Menon. I would like to give a brief introduction. Professor Menon is an architect, urban planner, and conservation consultant practicing in Delhi for over 40 years. He is actively engaged in research, and his contributions have been extensively published in professional journals and several academic books. You would like to know that he was not only the founder member, one of the founder members of INTACH, but it's already been mentioned that in 2004, he was the principal author of the INTACH Charter for the conservation of unprotected architectural heritage and sites in India. Today, as we are hoping to bring together academics and practitioners to reflect on evolving practices of heritage conservation, focusing especially on India, and marking the 20 years of INTACH Charter, we humbly welcome you, sir, as our keynote speaker. Now, I would like to request Mr. Singh to felicitate Professor Menon. So, please give a big round of applause. Thank you so much, sir. Now I would like to request Professor Menon to please give the keynote address.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. It's home, and yet it's a place that one wants to engage with as an institution. So both I'd like to do today, that I'm not only talking to people who are family members, but also perhaps people who are engaged in conservation, engaged in our culture in a more objective way. So part of my talk is subjective, part of it is objective. Normally, I can't help it, but the two halves that come together here. So I will try and do that and try and explain what is meant, because the challenge that you've given me today is very difficult. To assess what happened in 20 years, to assess what's happened in 40 years of INTACH is not going to be an easy task. And it cannot be done, shall we say, in a clinical way. It cannot be clinical. It will have to be messy. It will have to be speculative. It will have to be, in many ways, more questioning than stating facts. So firstly, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. It's certainly a great honor to be here, as I said, be at home and be a part of the world of cultural heritage. We have discussed the subject before. And so quite often I have to make a distinction between what was said before and what I want to say now. A lot has been said to the same home audience before. So perhaps sometimes it bears repeating, but it also needs to be contextualized into what we want to say. Now, to begin with, there are two themes of this symposium. One is, of course, conserving culturally significant places in India. And the second is marking 20 years of INTACH Charter. Both have their roots in the idea of INTACH. Now, I'm stressing the fact of idea of INTACH because much of it has to do with that idea. What was the idea of INTACH that has generated 40 years of work that we are going to be listening to today? And what was the idea of INTACH that 20 years ago generated a charter that we are going to be marking today? How are they related? What relationship do they have? As I said, each of them have an independent point of view. You know, the paper writers, generation after generation writing papers, they wrote it 40 years ago, they're writing 40 years now, later now, and 40 years later, perhaps again, we'll be having another symposium on culturally significant places and studies. So we need to sort of begin to make some sense. What are we doing? Are we generation after generation going to do studies on culturally significant places and make a presentation and pat ourselves on the back and say that we're a complex civilization and say that we are extremely diverse and etc. Then what? What do we make out of that? We said that 40 years ago. We're saying that today, and perhaps 40 years later we'll be saying it again. Maybe with less intensity, because each 40-year generation, things are getting more and more globalized, more and more homogenized, more and more like what others are doing. So the question today is that we need to assess 40 years ago what were we saying, and 40 years later what are we saying now? And 20 years ago what was the charter, and what is it now? So both need to be discussed, and both have, as I said, and I repeat, to do something with the idea of India, idea of INTACH, idea of culture, idea of Indian culture, etc., etc. It's I say that with a sort of bit of background because just a few weeks ago I was addressing a similar subject at ICOMOS in Brazil. There also they were marking 60 years of the Venice Charter, and they decided to have a symposium in which they said, look, we have to revisit the Venice Charter because 60 years, a lot has happened since 64 to 2024. A lot has happened. Venice Charter was written in 1964 with a particular ethos, with a particular cultural idea. And 60 years later, we got to revisit it. Are we in the position to revisit the INTACH Charter? Do we have sufficient material to say that this is what we want to do? We want to revisit it. There was something that was good about it, something that was a problem with it, and we got to revisit because the world has changed. Now, I would like to do that with the papers also. Since the 40 years ago, we were talking about culturally significant places. 40 years later, we are talking about culturally significant places. What's happened in the meantime? I'm just, while we were having tea, having a chat with someone who's written a paper on Ekamra Kshetra, and it struck me that 30 years ago, we did a study on Ekamra Kshetra. And here, 30 years later, there's another paper is being presented on Ekamra Kshetra. What's the difference? Who's assessing? Who's wondering what was the study then, what's the study now, and what will be the study undoubtedly 30 years from now when another paper on Ekamra Kshetra is presented, or any other such culturally significant place. So we need to do that. So part of my talk today is, you've got to forgive me, it's not a prepared paper. It comes from the heart, so it'll be a bit chaotic, it'll be a bit impressionistic, maybe not as scientifically rigorous as your papers that have been presented because you spent a lot of time writing your papers, very intellectually rigorous. This may not be as intellectually rigorous because it comes from a particular point of view. So as I said, 30 years ago a study on Ekamra Kshetra was done. 30 years ago a study on Banaras was done. 30 years later we know what's happened to Vishwanath Dham in Banaras. And one wonders what happened 30 years ago when we did a study on Banaras, and What's happened 30 years later when this Vishwanath Dham project is done? Or you can name on and on and on, because right now we are into the midst of Hridaya project of Government of India. We are doing a lot of culturally significant places. Who's evaluating what was said then, what is being done now? Who will say something that's being done later? So one thing is, of course, we in India are extremely intelligent. Give us a subject, we'll tell you something intelligent about it. There's no doubt about it. So whether it is culturally significant places, we'll give you a very intelligent study of it. The question I'm asking is, as INTACH, what is our role? Is our role to merely regurgitate papers, keep presenting papers, at some point have volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, volume 4, volume 5, but who reads these volumes? Which brings me to my first point, who reads the charters? So we are marking 20 years of INTACH Charter today at the symposium, and we are saying we want to mark it. Mark it why? Who's read it? Who's followed it? What critical ideas do we have about the charter? I say that again with a bit of a unfortunate experience, because again last week I was at in Kathmandu evaluating projects that were undertaken after the earthquake, and INTACH has done a lot of work there. Others have also done a lot of work there, and it gave me a sort of a bird's eye view of what is happening in conservation, because they were well documented. A lot of things, it's not as though you look and have an opinion. These are documented projects. So there's so much to talk. Who evaluates it? Who says that what INTACH did was good, bad, indifferent? Who says that what others did was good, bad, indifferent? If so, why so? So I pose it as a question to the symposium. What is the purpose of the symposium? Are we merely documenting and making presentation and patting ourselves on the back and waiting for the next symposium? So are more papers will be presented? So who is at the end of the day assessing what is happening? And where are we going? So the first point, as I said, I want to make is that one of the points of a charter is that they are markers. 20 years ago, when we said that after 20 years of INTACH, we were going to have a INTACH Charter, it was in a way marking what happened in the first 20 years and assessing what ought to be done, not to be done. As I told you, unfortunately, who has read it, who has followed it? Yet you're calling me here 20 years later to talk about it. Who am I going to talk to? Who will listen? Who will understand? So again, I'm used as the same object, call him every 20 years to talk about the charter. Because he's a grandfather, maybe he'll become a great-grandfather, maybe he'll become a great-great-grandfather, and maybe 20 years later call him again, if I'm still alive, to talk about the charter once again. What is it that you want to hear from me about the charter? Because certainly 20 years ago when we made the charter, it was with a very specific purpose. 20 years of INTACH was over. We had a history of projects that INTACH had accomplished, and we said, okay, now what do we make out of this? What sense do we make out of it? And that sense, again, I said with very humbly, is not a critical point of view. It is a position. But that position makes sense only if it is criticized, only if it is evaluated, only if it is made, some kind of assessment is made. Had we done it? So 20 years later we're doing it. Have we still done it? So what are we marking 20 years later? What has happened in the 20 years since? As I said, one or two stray examples I gave because I'm personally involved. 30 years ago we did Ekamra Kshetra, 30 years later we are doing Ekamra Kshetra. So what's the difference? Is it just another paper that's being presented? And just it fills up our volume, the wonderful volume we brought out of the papers being presented at the symposium, and we get on with our work, business as usual. So at this symposium in Brazil, I challenged ICOMOS. I'm saying that you had a charter in 1964. You are revisiting it. And you are revisiting it again, perhaps as a routine. Because 60 years have passed, yes, we've got to revisit it. And I pose a challenge to them. I'm saying that, look, what's wrong with the Venice Charter, that it is a universal document. And yet we are talking about a culture that is diverse. So what does a universal document on conservation, what can it do for a diverse cultural reality? How do we govern diversity? We can govern homogeneity. Dictators do that. We have one point of view, you are right, you are wrong. And that's quite easy to do. Now, is the Venice Charter doing the same thing? Everyone said, no, in the 40 years later and all that, we have had so many other charters. We have included it, we have widened it, we have made it much more reflecting the reality of the diversity of the world. Is it? Or does the core still remain authenticity and integrity the way intact, as the way Venice Charter defined it? And I say that particularly because when I evaluated the projects in Kathmandu, the only language that was being used was that we are so honest to Venice Charter. So we are very good. We have done a wonderful job in Kathmandu. I'm saying that, look, Kathmandu, what was their expectations of culture? INTACH, what is our expectation of culture? And where does the Venice Charter fit into all this? Why are we using that as a benchmark to say that, look, we have preserved the integrity of these temples that had collapsed. We have preserved the authenticity of these temples that had collapsed. And we have resurrected it. So what are we proving and to whom? Who are we addressing? And one can make all kinds of silly examples. It's just like saying that the most handsome person is a 6 foot tall, blonde, blue-eyed person. And I will try my best to be 6 foot tall, blonde and blue-eyed. 40 years later, I'll still try and be blonde and blue-eyed. And at some point, you've got to say that, look, what are we doing? Why is that the benchmark? Why is blonde, blue-eyed and 6 feet tall and all the benchmark? Why are we trying so hard to say that, yes, a disaster has happened, now we'll come back to that benchmark? So these are some of the questions that struck me in Kathmandu. This is a question that I asked ICOMOS. And I challenge ICOMOS that can we have a charter that governs diversity, not governs universality. The charter does a brilliant job governing universality. If you read the Venice Charter, it's a gem of a document. Beautifully written, compellingly argued, in a succinct, few words, saying the most. But it is entirely Eurocentric. It is blonde, blue-eyed and 6 feet tall. So what are we talking about? Why are we saying that that is the benchmark of conservation? So 20 years after INTACH, in 1984, 2004, when we were looking at the project, it struck me at least that what are we trying to do? Why would I want to do an INTACH Charter when we have got perfectly good charters? The Venice Charter, the hundreds of the charter, ICOMOS charters, all compellingly done with brilliant minds, with deep philosophy, 200, 300 years of philosophy. What is it that India can contribute? What is it that INTACH, 20-year-old INTACH can contribute? Because really at that point, the mood was that in 20 years we have achieved a hell of a lot. But what have we achieved? That we have become truer to the Venice Charter. We understood the Venice Charter better. We have understood the diversity of Venice Charter. Is the Venice Charter the benchmark? And at Brazil, I gave an example. I'm saying that it's very hard to talk about culture and charter in these terms. I'm saying let's talk about something else that is much more human. Let's talk about patriarchy. Patriarchy is a human condition. We say that with patriarchy we have got social order. Women are in their place, men are in their place, and so there's harmony in this world because of patriarchy. Patriarchy is not a rule, not a law, just like Venice Charter is not a rule, not a law. It's just a statement of principles. But if the statements of principles becomes the law, it becomes a problem. And I argued that ICOMOS, you make these principles, guidelines, in the global south they become laws. Then we begin to fight with each other. We go to court and say this is wrong, that is wrong. And all you said very innocently was the Venice Charter is a set of principles. You apply the principles the way you want. But instead of applying it the way we want, we are trying to apply it exactly what a blonde, blue-eyed, 6 feet tall person should be. We're trying to make those principles into a reality. So that's the problem with charters. So when the INTACH Charter was drafted, we said, look, again, it's a set of principles. We are a very diverse country. It's hard for me to tell this region, that region, what to do, Who are we? Who's INTACH to say all that? And I think the 40 papers that you presented, 48 papers you presented will reveal that. There's such diversity. Who can talk about a universal order in these places? But as a nation, as a country, as a civilization, we must have some kind of a sort of binding. What is it binding we're talking about? Is it the charter? Are these the principles? What is it? So 20 years ago, when we said that this was it, it was trying to bring some order out of diversity. Because at that time, we could visualize two main points of view. One was the official point of view, the government point of view, the ASI point of view. And the other was the vast majority of the rest of the country that said, we'll do what we want. We've been doing it for 1,000 years, we'll continue to do it. Whether it's the Sthapatis or the Sompuras or whoever it is, they don't need the charters, they don't need Venice Charter, they don't need this blonde, blue-eyed fellow coming and telling them what to do. They have been doing it for 1,000 years and more, and they've got well-documented situation. So at that time, 20 years later, we realized we are dealing with a very complex situation in India, where we've got these two situations. Both are our heritage. I can't claim that the ASI is not my heritage. It's 150 years old. It's got a huge amount of legacy. It's got a huge amount of work done. Maybe a lot of our cultural sites exist because of ASI, because of that. So I cannot rubbish it. On the other hand, I have this 1,000 years or plus of legacy. I can't ignore it, which is being ignored, of course. And thank God it's being ignored, because it's thrived because we ignored it. It continues to thrive because we ignored it. No one has come and chartered it. No one's come and said that do this, do that. Nothing. So they survived. So the INTACH Charter 20 years ago was trying to address that dilemma. How do we, as almost a Janus-faced person, proceed? I'm looking forward and looking backwards. Where do I go? How do I go? How do I negotiate the cultural, my cultural legacy? So that was 20 years ago. 20 years later, what do we do? How do I assess it? So that is, I suppose, part of my problem, that what do I talk about today? Who do I talk to? What do I discuss? Because one thing is very clear. One theme of the symposium is very successful. There were called for papers, over 100 applications came, 48 were received. All out, my God, that shows a robust intellectual climate. A robust intellectual climate. Was it due to INTACH? I don't know. Perhaps it was, partly not. 40 years ago, there was hardly a conservation professional. Then INTACH came. Now we've got conservation professionals. So were the conservation professionals as a result of INTACH or not? Would it have happened in any case? I don't know. Maybe it would have happened in any case. But certainly, the INTACH was, shall we say, the cusp, the turning point. And something happened in 1984, which changed the direction of the narrative. The profession proliferated, intellectualism proliferated, studies proliferated. We got to know much more about our heritage, the intangibles, you name it. And I see Dr. Shikha sitting here, context it came about also because of that amount it has revealed about ourselves. So all that happened, maybe context would have come in any case. I don't blame you for INTACH, but context would have come about in any case. But yes, at some point something happened then and something happened. So 20 years later we assessed it, we came up with a charter and tried to say, well, what sense do we make out of this? Now, where do I go from here? But a similar prognosis cannot be made of the charter. So whereas when INTACH was formed, maybe because of INTACH, may not be because of INTACH, the idea of culture proliferated, the profession proliferated, education proliferated, a lot of things happened. Maybe because of INTACH, may not be part of it, but it happened almost simultaneously, and one can say that there's some kind of a thing, but the same prognosis can't be made with the charter. 20 years ago, we tried to assess where we. Today, 20 years later, we are assessing it again. Am I going to go over the same grounds? Are we gone any further? I don't know. Maybe this is what we should be discussing, and it's not part of the symposium. It's only my task to try and make some sense out of it. And I said that it is gone to a global level, because having just returned from Brazil, I realized that ECOMOS is also worried about what is happening. Are we worried about it? So they're also worried that, look, we feel that we're leaving maybe 90% of the world behind. ECOMOS is thriving. It's got world heritage, you name it, it's a powerful organization, everything is there. But even they're beginning to realize maybe they're leaving a big world chunk behind. And so let's have a symposium, they said. They invited people like me to talk about this, and there were 2 or 3 other people, very interesting talks. Maybe you should be having something like that. But where is the material? Where are the people who will talk about it? So we know, for example, that the roots of the Venice Charter have Eurocentric basis. And we know that it was not meant to be a law, but it's been turned into a law by our minds. Not because anyone come with a gun. They did that 200 years ago, colonialism. It was called a civilizing mission. So in a way, the Venice Charter is also a civilizing mission. It has civilized all of us to accept the fact that blonde, 6 feet tall, blue-eyed person is the norm. That is a civilizing mission, and we have all fallen for it. And I know we have fallen for it because when I went to Kathmandu and heard the defense of what we are doing, it is that blonde, 6 foot tall fellow that's being always shown to me and say, look, how close we are to it, how much we reflect that, how honest we are. And that had, Dr. Ravinder, I should talk to you something about it. I heard structural engineers also trying to say, we are making use of wood and making it fit the IS code. And I said, look, how? Tell me the joints, where are the movements? So how, if an earthquake were to take place, how is this wooden building going to behave? So I think you were one of the consultants also. And I tried to say, look, someday I'm going to meet Dr. Menon and ask, how is it going to happen? So maybe we need another criteria, another way to resurrect buildings that have collapsed, traditional buildings that have collapsed, and that we'll have to accept the fact it is not going to fit the IS codes. Because the IS codes use different materials, different strategies to make a building safe. Those buildings, to some extent, can be improved, but to what extent? Are we giving the right impression? Or are we saying, yes, and I read these reports, they say, yes, it now fits the IS codes. I said, what? How does it fit the IS codes? Using the same, by putting a wooden beam underneath along the base, you've made it earthquake proof? How did it happen? So I'm saying these are the kind of questions that we need to ask. Not write papers about the diversity of our thing, but question that and see how do we, where do we stand. So 20 years later, we got to understand how do we make our buildings disaster proof. And I've heard wonderful dialogue when an international consultant comes and dialogues. There is a dialogue. There is no expert saying, do this, it'll be safe. They give and forth, back and forth, and some answer comes. Are we engaging in that? Do we have that kind of dialogue happening in INTACH? That we can talk to structural engineers, we can talk to historians, we can talk to the society, the community, and come up with an answer saying that, look, this is what we can do, this is the best we can do. It will not be like a new building built fitting the IS codes. However, this is what our cultural legacy is, this is how we're going to proceed and go on from there. So the roots of the INTACH Charter are what? As I said, this Janus phase civilization that we are, and we said, let's make some sense out of it. 20 years later, we are less Janus phase. We are more one direction phased. We are more directed towards the universal. And the tradition continues. Thank God, it continues. The dialogue has not taken place for 20 years. Maybe it will not take place for another 20 years. And maybe 20 years later, we'll still be talking about the same thing. So the deep structure of our cultural imagination of a post-colonial society has not been plumbed, has not been worked out. So I just would like to end up with just a few random thoughts. As I said, I'm sorry for this disjointed emotional outburst. But we are talking in India about universalism and diversity. Yet we are tending towards universalism, not towards diversity. Our studies say that we are a very diverse culture. Our practices show that we are a very, we would like to follow universal principles. Is that a challenge for INTACH to take? Is that a challenge for the INTACH Charter to take? That how do we govern diversity, where different points of views have to be brought onto the same page? So I don't want to get into why of this diversity. There's a lot of, I think the problem is really that we are also conflated by politics, and that is we have the idea of political nationalism. So it's cultural nationalism equivalent. Does culture has to be national also? Do we need to have a cultural policy that is national cultural policy? Can we have a diverse cultural policy where one says something, another says something else, and yet we are Indian? Now that's the challenge of a charter, and that is what 20 years ago when we were trying to draft the INTACH Charter, we tried to do that. It's bad, good, bad. As I said again, I'm not here to judge. But that was the aim that we said, that how do we make some sense? So how do we manage diversity? So the INTACH Charter was a response to that vision. Now, in a globalizing world, the second point is, that's the first point, that INTACH Charter was about how to manage diversity. And it's not a prescription, it's not a law. It was how to engage with diversity. And that we made certain strategies, and no one has really, someone rubbished it, no one's really questioned it intelligently. In a globalizing world order, can our understanding of our civilization legacy make a contribution to world heritage? Instead of the other way around. We are trying to make our heritage into world heritage. And in trying to do that, we are trying to universalize our practices. We're trying to universalize our points of views. We're trying to universalize because we want world heritage. That seems to be the carrot that we want to capture. Why? Because in trying to be, as it's again, pardon the thing, 6 foot tall and blonde and blue-eyed, unless I am that, I'm not world heritage. So we try and contort ourselves, contort our civilization to try and meet the objectives of world heritage. So the point I'm trying to make is that can an Indian charter talk about diversity and tell the world how it should be governing itself? That was the subject of my talk in Brazil. In fact, that was the point I was making, that we have something to tell you. You have very little to tell me. What you have got to tell me is very valuable. I listen to it because I've got 150 years of history of it. So I'm very familiar with it. So, but can we have a dialogue? So the INTACH Charter was conceived to make that contribution to world heritage. There can be introduced diversity as part of it. So at this symposium, as we pride ourselves in the robustness of our cultural achievements in conservation studies and practices, we need to understand that to make 20 years of INTACH Charter, we need to use it as a measure of those achievements. Can the charter be a measure that we use to understand the 48 papers that came? How does it measure up to the charter? Or are we just saying, oh, they're wonderful studies, beautiful studies, brilliant studies, and they have been published now? So can the charter be used as a measure? So that is the third point, what I can say 20 years later, my thoughts on the charter. There are 2 or 3 things I'd like to just say. Besides that, I did use the example of patriarchy and say that, look, feminists have challenged patriarchy and the world has not fallen apart. In fact, maybe we are a better world because the feminists have challenged patriarchy. Will the world fall apart if we challenge the Venice Charter? Will it fall apart? Or will it become a more robust and more happier place? So when I go to the classrooms, the many classrooms that I go to in India and challenge it, they never call me a second time. Because I am, after all, challenging their syllabus. The syllabus says that, look, the conservation is about the Venice Charter, authenticity, integrity, blah, 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 blah. It is what conservation is about. So when they called me and I said, look, who says? Why? Have we tried to do what we ought to do? And when I say the Venice Charter, even the profession denigrates it. And who was the profession? My students. So I'm saying this is the situation we are 20 years later. Even when my students denigrate the Venice Charter, the INTACH Charter, 20 years later, what do I say? Am I going to say that, look, let's try once more with feeling? Or what? How do we address? How do we mark the 20 years of the INTACH Charter? I read the reviews of criticism, all valid criticism, perfectly valid. Where has it taken us? What has it done to the charter? So the question is, do we need a charter at all? Who reads the charters? Why is it that in a post-colonial society we convert a charter into a weapon? 100 meters, no more, you have a problem, you got this, you got that, integrity be lost, authenticity be lost, blah, blah, blah. Why? Where do these ideas in a post-colonial society come from? Does it come from our legacy of 1,000 years? Or does it come from a legacy of 150 years of colonialism? And is globalization another civilizing mission that is civilizing us? As we talk more and more about conservation, are we falling into the same colonial trap? So I'll end with that. I'm sorry for this bit of an emotional outburst, but it's like your baby who's gone astray. So when your baby goes astray, you get upset. And I'm upset that this baby has gone astray. It has gone nowhere. And in fact, it's going the opposite way. It is embracing universalism. It's embracing this 6-foot boy I don't want her to fall in love with. And how does a parent then respond? So I use the example of patriarchy, and I'll end up with one last example. In feminist studies, there's a famous theoretician called Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde made a very interesting statement, and that is a lesson for us. She says that the master's tool cannot dismantle the master's house. Yet, we are using the master's tool to humanize the Venice Charter, make it much more palatable, much more universal. Let's listen to Audre Lorde and say, understand feminism and say that the master's tool is never going to dismantle the master's house. And it's a philosophical thought, goes on and on about that to give an idea. So when you have 48 papers, you've got 48 points of view. Will they be used to dismantle the master's house? Or will they be used to reinforce the master's house? Make it much more palatable, make it much more inclusive, make it much more, much more diverse. So the second point. The third point I want to leave you with is that I don't know if you know the story of the ship of Theseus. Ship of Theseus is a historical and a philosophical problem, you might call it. Theseus was a Greek myth, a warrior who went to Troy to fight. He went in a ship, fully fitted, went to Troy. 10 years later, he came back in the same ship. In the 10 years, the ship had undergone many, many changes. Masts had fallen, the sides had got rotten, they changed it. So what came back 10 years later with Theseus, was it the ship of Theseus? So this is what's happening to our civilization, what's happening to our culture. And we get alarmed that, my God, no, the authenticity is gone, integrity is gone, this is gone, that's gone. I remind you of the story of the ship of Theseus. And not conservationists, but philosophers have dwelt on this because it's a big philosophical problem. Was the ship of Theseus the original ship of Theseus or not? And the philosophers came to some very interesting conclusion, which you and I as conservationists may not agree. Philosophers said that ultimately, if it is still considered the ship of Theseus, it is the ship of Theseus. Or even if there's one element of that original ship there, it is the ship of Theseus. So the philosophers were open enough to say that, yes, the ship of Theseus was still the ship of Theseus, if at least it's recognized as the ship of Theseus, and one element at least is the ship of Theseus. Are we conservationists willing to consider that as a problem? Or are we going to say that no, it has to be still blonde and blue-eyed, and unless it is not the ship of Theseus? So I leave you those thoughts. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions, of course, but time permitting.
Thank you so much, sir. You've definitely given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm hoping that the sessions that follow, we're able to reflect on some of the issues that you've highlighted. Before we proceed, I would like to announce the 2025 cycle of INTACH Awards for Interdisciplinary Heritage Documentation. To just briefly introduce it, INTACH offers a nationwide awards program for interdisciplinary documentation of heritage in India. The aim of it is to develop and promote sensitivity and awareness towards heritage in undergraduate students across the country. And we have been running this program since 2015, and today we'll be launching the 2025 cycle. So I would once again ask Professor Menon to please come up and launch the cycle. We'll be playing a video. Sorry, sir. Just one more time. The video.
Oh.
Yes. That's all. Okay.